so we are recording now. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation with experts on the topic of cultivating entrepreneurial ecosystems. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I'd like to share a little bit about the event. This discussion is part of a series that this week, which is part of a launch of 3 new reports from Andy. They're called Evidence Syntheses, and they're launching this week to cover this topic, as well as job quality and talent management in the SGB sector. So the hope is that we could pull together as much relevant research, particularly highlighting academic research and gathering key takeaways. The idea is that Andy kind of did your homework for you and read all the reports. And this is kind of the Cliff Notes version of the research. Hopefully, since we know practitioners and everyone in the field is super busy and there's a lot of research out there, this is a helpful tool or resource. So with that, I will introduce you to our panelists. The first is Dr. Eric Sam, Professor of Strategy, Organization and Entrepreneurship and Dean of the Utrecht University School of Economics in the Netherlands. Next to this, he is Faculty Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at Utrecht University and founding board member of the Utrecht University Strategic Research Theme Institutions for Open Societies. He's been affiliated with many institutes globally, including the University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, Max Planck Institute of Economics, IMT School of Advanced Studies, Lucca, Indiana University at Bloomington, Tel Aviv University, Hitotsubashi University, and Zhejiang University. Very challenging pronunciations this morning. He's a leading scholar on entrepreneurial ecosystems and conducts research on the context and consequences of entrepreneurship more broadly. He has co-authored books, book chapters, and articles in a variety of disciplines, including economics, geography, business management, and public administration. He is editor of the journal Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and next to his scientific work, he often engages with governments, startups, and corporates on innovation and entrepreneurship. He has served many ministries in the Netherlands and other countries, the European Commission, OECD, G20, United Nations, and the World Bank. He is on the advisory board of several public and private sector entrepreneurship organizations as well. So we're very happy to have you, Eric, and thank you so much for joining us. Our other panelist is Ham Namakajo, Andy's director at Uganda Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative, also known as UEEI, which is probably what I'll be calling it from now on. Ham is working to strengthen the enabling environment for small and growing businesses in Uganda by facilitating the collaboration between all intermediaries supporting entrepreneurs to collectively address challenges within the ecosystem. He's passionate about enabling entrepreneurs in their various respects, from musicians, agripreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, and everything in between, to achieve their dreams. So he was most recently focused on creating better outcomes for creatives, particularly working to figure out how to help the long tail of musicians make consistent incomes for themselves at Feza. Previously, he was country manager for Google Uganda before leaving to develop his own startup at Feza as co-founder, with a stint as Jumaya Uganda country manager in between. Prior to Google, Ham worked as a management consultant with Bain & Company in their Los Angeles office, covering the media and entertainment, semiconductor, consumer products, and healthcare industries. He started his career with the Uganda Communications Commission as a spectrum management engineer. So thank you, Ham, and thank you both for joining us today. So as I start off this conversation, I'm going to quickly share 3 key takeaways from the report, just to get everyone familiar. But before that, I'm just going to share a few important notes. So as I mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and will be made available as a resource on the Andy website. That's just a heads up for everyone. Also, please mute yourself upon entering. I think that's automatic, but just to prevent any distraction. And then if you have any questions as we are chatting, please submit them in the chat, and I will either call on you or I can just read your question out loud. Okay, so moving on to the key takeaways. So the first is that mature ecosystems share a common set of characteristics. So the presence and strength of entrepreneur and institutional networks, entrepreneurial culture, accelerators and other support organizations, finance providers, and supportive policy are common among mature entrepreneurial ecosystems. Ecosystem development involves complex, nonlinear interactions among these factors. So there's no singular growth path for ecosystems, and each community has to build upon their existing strengths and resources to identify areas of competitive advantage. And then finally, interventions should build upon local attributes and strengths. So while there's some evidence of successful outcomes from ecosystem building interventions, policymakers should focus primarily on setting a strong foundation for the ecosystem so it can take advantage of new market opportunities as they arise. So with that very long introduction, I would love to welcome both of our panelists. So to get us started, I'd love to ask you, Eric, about how you in your research and in your work think about entrepreneurial ecosystems. In some of your research, you've explored the various definitions, and I'm just curious what you find is most practical or useful in your work.
Yeah, so good science is about good definitions, I'm afraid. So the good thing about entrepreneurial ecosystems is that this has been heralded and also recognized by a lot of different stakeholder groups. So venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, governments. And I think it has really provided a shared language to meet and collaborate to improve the economy, and especially the economy in order to enable it for entrepreneurs. But at the end of the day, if we want to improve it, we need to come to a sort of generic shared definition. And together with some colleagues around the globe, we've been sort of putting our heads together, and we came to define it as an entrepreneurial ecosystem as a set of interdependent actors and factors that is governed in such a way that it enables productive entrepreneurship in a particular territory. That's a mouthful of abstract wordings. On the other hand, I think it's very much also in line with the recent Andy report in the sense that we focus on interdependence. So meaning that we are talking about complex systems, not about simple systems in which you can push one button and then entrepreneurship and welfare will go up. Now, if you push one button, there will happen a lot of other things, or not. Nothing will happen because there are some interdependencies that are not well worked out. It's also, in spite of the metaphor or analogy, it is about social systems, not about natural systems. So that's why we put quite some emphasis on the governance of the system. So leadership, networks, and how you bring people together, how you realize collective action, because it is about public and private parties coming together and enabling the environment for entrepreneurship, not for plants or corals to grow, so to say. And it's also about, not about all kinds of entrepreneurship, it's about productive entrepreneurship, because well, entrepreneurship can also be destructive, unproductive. So it is really about entrepreneurship that's not only good for the entrepreneur, him or herself, but also for the economy at large. And then at the end of the day, I think this definition, even though there can be better or other definitions, but I think we should have some convergence about the animal that we are talking about, enables us to build up a framework for analysis and action to improve it. And I think that is also the nice thing about the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach, that it really connects science and practice, brings together insights from all kinds of different academic disciplines, but also connects science to practice in the different elements of the ecosystem. So venture capitalists, service providers, government officials that come together, talk the same language, and all have the same, let's say, purpose or direction to improve the local or regional economy in order to make it more entrepreneurial, and at the end of the day, increase welfare.
I'm so glad you brought up enabling environments, because that leads me perfectly into my question for Ham. But actually before that, Ham, if you want to, I realize people might not be familiar with UEI, so if you want to give a quick description, and then I was going to ask you how UEI is applying the ecosystem approach towards developing that enabling environment for SGBs.
Great, thank you. UEEI is a program out of Andy. We are working to unlock the potential of SGBs within Uganda by getting all the various actors within the ecosystem to work collaboratively together to address the issues that stand in the way of us supporting the entrepreneurs we seek to support. And how we're applying the ecosystem approach. First of all, there's a recognition of the interconnectedness and the dependence of the various spheres of activities and the actors. And also a realization that a lot of this activity is happening in silos, many times, which these are sectoral silos. So you'll have entrepreneurial communities within the agricultural sector, within the tourism sector, small scale industries, what have you. And there's little sort of talking between these communities and even within the sectors, there's little interconnectedness. So what we're trying to do is do a bottoms-up approach where we get all the actors across the table, bring them to the table, sit together and decide on what the priority issues for our ecosystem are, and then work collaboratively towards solving these problems. And this is in contrast to previous efforts around entrepreneurial support, where various entities like governments, research organizations, development partners will, do some research, spot gaps, and then design interventions and go to roll them out. The issue there being that many times the people that these interventions are being designed for are not part and parcel of the design of the interventions, and these might not be the most critical issues they're facing at the moment. So what tends to happen is the recipients of these interventions will not be able to commit enough time or resources towards participating in these interventions, and thereby, the impact that was envisioned is never realized. So we're saying, let's have the people who the interventions are being made for be central to this, to defining what the priorities are and designing the interventions. And so what we're doing is, one, taking a network approach towards building this collective action around that. We are creating spaces for the ecosystem actors to connect and build trusting relationships in the hope that with this trust, they'll come and, an exchange of information about the activities, knowledge, and expertise of each actor, with which the actors can start, some sort of coordination within their activities, eventually leading to a situation where the actors can take advantage of each other's expertise and knowledge to collaborate on addressing those particular issues that affect them.
Great. So yeah, you mentioned so many actors in the ecosystem, which I think is one of the things that emerged from our research, was how many systems are at play and how many important variables you have to take into consideration. Eric, with so many actors and so many nuances to understanding an ecosystem, I'm wondering if researchers have been able to identify key leverage points in ecosystems or strategies for identifying those leverage points.
There's not one silver bullet or one key leverage point, because that would exactly be against the logic of a complex system. So that is there's no easy way out, so to say. It's not just pushing the bottom government spending and then the other things will happen, for sure not. You first have to diagnose before you intervene. Just like when you get a medicine, I hope you first go to the doctor to have a good intervention. And these interventions, I think economies are even more complex than human bodies. So you need to get to know the local economy with local knowledge of many stakeholders involved. On the other hand, you also would like to have a sort of a objective diagnosis as a starting point for higher level discussions. But having said that, our research globally sort of shows that there should be at least 10 elements in place for an economy to flourish as an entrepreneurial economy. And these are, let's say, very fundamental elements like formal institutions, an enhancing culture, a physical infrastructure that is in place, sufficient demand, and more proximate elements like networks, leadership, capital, finance, intermediate services. That sounds like quite a bit, but it is, in the end of the day, enabling productive entrepreneurship on a large scale also necessitates a lot of elements that need to be in place. That doesn't mean that if one of these elements in place, productive entrepreneurship does not flourish, but it explains to a large extent why productive entrepreneurship flourishes much more in one place than the other. So at the end of the day, the lesson is if you need to improve them all. And if you improve them all, productive entrepreneurship is likely to flourish more than without improving them. Of course, I see you thinking, but isn't then there a limited set of factors that is more important than others? I'm very hesitant to prioritize a few of them, but for example, our latest research on 273 regional entrepreneurial ecosystems in Europe, I should really emphasize Europe, shows that it is especially formal institutions, finance, and talent that seem to be more central than the other elements. Not saying that the others are unimportant, but if you look at how these elements are interconnected to the other ones, these three seem to be more central than the others. But again, this is based on European research. I cannot rule out that it will be different in other contexts. And at the end of the day, all the 10 elements matter. But it depends very much on the local context. Which of those elements is the weakest, or are the set of elements are the weakest, and then the logic is that you first tackle the weakest elements in the system, and that is almost by nature specific for each and every context. So you first need to have this diagnosis and a proper dialogue to get to know if these are really the weakest elements in the system, and also to get more rich local knowledge to enrich the let's say, the more objective diagnosis.
I imagine to diagnose things in the ecosystem, you need a lot of data, which is obviously a huge challenge in almost any context. But can you talk a little bit about your experience with gathering data in the various geographies or contexts that you've worked in, and what are some of the challenges that maybe you faced?
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news. The good news is that we are living in the age of big data. So there's now much more data available than, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. And I'm not just talking about census, government delivered data on innovation networks, on investments in R&D, etc., but also data on mobility. So with our mobile phones, we are delivering data on the mobility and accessibility of places. And with Facebook and LinkedIn, we also deliver insights on our networks. And also with global positioning systems, you can see the energy intensity of particular areas. So there's much more data now available than let's say 20 or 30 years ago. So I think that is good news. The bad news is that this is not rocket science. So we're still not able, and I think we will never be able to design the optimal entrepreneurial ecosystem, because we are very often dealing with imperfect data. So if you want to understand the role of talent, you need to know a lot about different segments of the human population, the labor market, to understand the supply and demand of skills, for example. And I think that is really a very tough job to get a perfect insight into that. And then, of course, the next jump would be insight into how all these different elements work out together to enhance particular types of entrepreneurship. And then, to make things even more complicated, we also would like to have entrepreneurship that has a positive effects on all kinds of welfare outcomes. So we now talk about the Sustainable Development Goals very often. So the question is, which type of entrepreneurship affects which type of sustainable development goal or welfare dimension the most? And that, of course, is also still a huge challenge to see what works best. On the other hand, entrepreneurship is very much about acting and doing, and about experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So even though these are complicated and complex issues, doing nothing is not an option either.
That's a great point, and brings me to a question from the audience, which is, how can you avoid analysis paralysis? So yeah, when diagnosing such complex ecosystems, like, how do you balance the need for action?
Yeah, a good diagnosis is, of course, important as a starting point. On the other hand, things only change very slowly. So sometimes you're talking about an endpoint that is 5 to 10 years away, but you should act tomorrow to start to improve it. So you cannot wait, first of all, for the diagnosis to be perfect. That's also why I said it's not rocket science. We are working with imperfect data, but you would like to have an informed dialogue of the stakeholders involved. And I think if you talk about a major fault or failure in entrepreneurial ecosystem development is not getting entrepreneurs and key stakeholders involved, just designing a policy from the government point of view. So, and that necessitates action. So in that sense, it's a collective learning process that is continuously ongoing. So diagnosis analysis should be part of it. You better make use of it. On the other hand, it is very much about action and learning. So there's perhaps a tendency of some governments to analyze and get analysts, let's say, get stuck into that. But I think there's even more often too little diagnosis than too much.
Interesting. Ham, welcome back. We're just talking about data, and I'm actually going to ask you, what are some of the experiences that UEI has had around data collection, and any challenges that you might have faced?
Yeah, that's always a huge problem in this realm. If I speak specifically, around, sort of an area that's important to us around technical assistance for small businesses. We do not have a great view of for example, what the business development service provider landscapes look like, what players are actually within the ecosystem, what type of services they provide, the quality they provide, what stages they actually provide these services to, and even data around how many businesses they're supporting potentially. So more broadly, the data on the state of the ecosystem is very hard to come by. Where it is, and it's not that it's not available. It's many times it's like living in silos silos within the various actors. You have proprietary databases. You have government databases that are not easily shareable for this data to be synthesized. But we are starting to see entities like Andy doing well in coming up with ecosystem snapshots for various countries. And like the name suggests, though, these are a glance of the ecosystem at a particular moment in time. And sometimes these snapshots have been done a while back and outdated. If you think about the COVID situation, the environment has changed significantly. So if you had a snapshot that was done in 2019, for example, the landscape has changed. And many players have come into the ecosystem, some have left, patterns of investment have changed, that sort of thing. So there's a need to make these snapshots living documents with data that's somewhat constantly updated. The question is always how to do this. Can we figure out a way to automatically scour websites that contain this information? How do we do so accurately? There's no standardized way of sort of reporting on various aspects of ecosystem. So it is a challenge, and one that's I think worth putting our collective heads to. Agreed.
Yes, that is one of the big drawbacks of snapshots. Is they are static and quickly expire. So with data kind of being the starting point for entrepreneurial ecosystems, Eric, I'm wondering, what are some of the important pieces your research and policy experience have revealed around the overall process of collective learning in ecosystems?
Yeah, so the research I'm involved in is very much also what we would like to call transdisciplinary. So it's also engaging with practitioners very often to understand the phenomenon and also to get inspired on the research we do. So we came to realize more and more that indeed entrepreneurial ecosystem development, as I would like to call it, it's not building, because entrepreneurial ecosystems are everywhere, but you would like to improve them or further develop them, is a collective learning exercise. And learning can only happen when you know what is wrong and what is good about the system. and it is collective. So you want to get the relevant stakeholders involved in a dialogue to discuss the diagnosis. Is this really what is happening? Because it is not rocket science. You don't have perfect data about what is happening. On the other hand, you would like to have some sort of objectified data to start with. And you also want to enrich the data with local knowledge from venture capitalists, from entrepreneurs from different segments, and then come to a sort of a prioritization of what is the weakest link in the system that holds entrepreneurs back to be more productive than they currently are. And once you have sort of come to this policy prioritization, and it can be very much a combination of public and private, you also need to choose an instrument. And I think that is also, Andy could really provide a platform to show what kind of instruments are available worldwide, for example, to tackle talent issues. The other report is about talent, finance, and of course, not to literally copy paste it to the other context, but at least to also have learnings from other contexts. And then it needs to be implemented, which you also need to have capacity and courage, and also patience, which is something scientists often forget about, the implementation part. But I think that's extremely important to understand why some ecosystems develop in a positive way and others don't. And then at the end of the day, you would also like to see whether these changes have been realized and whether the envisioned goals have been achieved. And given that it's a complex system, you never know in advance the perfect solution. So that means that you, not that you can do anything you want, well, you can, but you should also monitor what is happening and learn along the way. So that is, you don't get paralyzed by the diagnosis, but you would like to continuously monitoring what is happening to learn from your own implementation actions, but also learn when COVID or other crisis hits you, what needs to be prioritized, or perhaps whether actions are achieved by shocks in the environment, and what would be the next link, the weakest link that deserves attention, so to say. So really this process of collective learning and making connections to science, data, practitioners, I think that is really the way forward to have a context-specific generic approach to improving economies. Agreed.
And you mentioned having to choose like a specific avenue or intervention. And I think one of the major findings in our report was that there is a lack of, or a need for more examples of successful interventions or even unsuccessful ones to learn from. Ham, I'm curious from your perspective as someone who is heading an ecosystem initiative, what your experience has been in terms of finding, initiatives or interventions to reference or learn from, and how that experience has been.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to find, of course, whenever interventions are put in place, no one's going to say black and white, this one was, failed. We usually have a tendency to portray them in glowing terms, but we are starting to see, organizations like Village Capital that are showing, for example, an area that's very dear to us in our ecosystem. They're starting to support ESOs by helping them, for example, come up with more sustainable business models, enabling peer learning, and enabling them to connect their entrepreneurs to financing. So most BDS providers, usually it's just the training and capacity building. And so, entrepreneurs come to them, they take them through this building, and then what, right? So now one of the interventions that seems to be working is coupling BDS with some sort of financing at the end of it all, however small. It could be discounted loans and that sort of thing. So we're starting to see a few of those. We're also starting to see research around, the BDS space, for example, by Gideas, which has come up with the scale framework for delivering the potential of these BDS providers. Their scale is best practices around that acronym, S for selecting, being able to select the right enterprise for you as a BDS provider. You shouldn't be, trying to provide services across the breadth of the growth cycle or across sectors. The second bit being, charging enterprises, improving, showing that it improves the performance of those enterprises. Again, when companies have skin in the game, they tend to, dedicate a lot more resources towards these programs and ultimately become, more successful within the programs. And the other thing is address problems. We learn best by, problem solving. We see a shift to away from training and more. This is a problem I have, handhold me through that particular problem. And one size fits all doesn't seem to work, which is usually the mainstay of many of these cohort-based programs. And then, there's learning by evaluating the enterprise performance constantly, and also leading by example. A lot of these BDS providers are startups themselves. So the idea that you'd be providing help to someone and you yourself as are not set up for success is something that they need to look at. So the research is coming out more and more to that's basically amalgamating experiences from elsewhere, but overall it's difficult to sort of point to particular interventions and say that won't work, because every ecosystem has a different context. So, it's very hard to transfer one intervention from one place to another.
Yeah, very true. I'm going to shift a little bit now to the audience questions. We do have a couple. And one thing that I think is interesting is we actually haven't talked that much about entrepreneurs themselves. And so we have a question about the fact that the report spoke extensively about the need for an optimal entrepreneurial ecosystem from a startup and tech-focused perspective. And so someone is wondering if the same factors hold true when looking at kind of survival or growth of existing or not tech-focused businesses. So kind of like the not, super high-tech or kind of developed ecosystems. And that's for anyone.
Well, I can kick off and then Ham can take over. So on the one hand, it's a generic framework which has as its purpose to enable productive entrepreneurship without having a particular sector or industry in mind. On the other hand, of course, it's also horses for courses. So if you are setting up a tech business, it's much more likely that you build up on R&D that is present in the area. In contrast, if you are building an agriculture startup, then you're less dependent on knowledge. And if you have a crafts or creative industries startup, you're much more likely to depend on particular talent and skills in the area. So yes, I think each and every startup has a slightly different portfolio needed, and also you can, let's say, target for particular groups. But in a generic way, the 10 elements matter for each and every type of productive entrepreneurship.
I think, well, from my perspective, it's quite the approach is quite valid. Away from tech, our ecosystem is not very tech heavy. In fact, we are mainly an agricultural-based economy, and so the majority of the businesses within our ecosystem are agricultural-based. The point being that a lot of the issues you're trying to solve within an ecosystem will cut across sectors. In my particular ecosystem, in my particular ecosystem, for example, the issue around taxation, getting businesses investment ready cuts across, whether it is a tech sort of farm or an agricultural farm. A lot of our businesses, again, speaking to the second point, a lot of our businesses are run very informally. So when it comes to them trying to access finance, they're not set up well enough to start speaking to investors. So the interventions you're looking at are cutting across the board. It's not very sector specific. And then that's also connected to various other aspects in terms of attracting talent. So yeah, I think I'd posit that the approach is valid beyond the tech-enabled businesses.
Thanks so much for that insight on that question. I think we have another question from the audience from, I think, an Andy member. Abby, do you want to unmute and ask your question, and then we'll move to the last question?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So I was curious, and so I helped write the report, so I've been thinking a lot about this topic. And while we were able to point out some examples of interventions to help ecosystems grow, the data, it's hard to collect data that can really show that an intervention was effective, right? You have to sort of put the pieces together and make some assumptions. But I guess I'm curious from Eric's perspective, like, what is the academic view on interventions to support ecosystems? Like, is there any actual hard evidence that we can intervene, or do we always have to let these things sort of happen naturally as economies grow? And I know that's sort of what UEI is doing too, sort of that experimental approach to seeing if we can intervene. But I'm just curious, like, what's the actual evidence behind its effectiveness?
Yeah, that is a clear and valid question, but it's a bit hard to answer. Let me give two answers here. So first, perhaps a bit of a disappointing answer. There's no evidence on one or two silver bullet kind of interventions that always work. And that is exactly also as Ham just said, because each and every context is different. So that also means that one intervention, let's say, enhancing crowdfunding in a particular city or region, will not lead to the same increases in entrepreneurship and welfare in each and every context. So that makes it a bit difficult to compare. And I think that is also, so one of the great questions from the audience was, isn't there too much fuss about entrepreneurial ecosystems? Well, I think there is, but I think it's also doing more justice to the local context than previous approaches. So in the old days, everybody was going for microfinance, or everybody was going for good governance, without knowing what the actual quality of the governance or microfinance was, and how the other elements were acting in sync, enhancing or perhaps constraining microfinance effects on entrepreneurship. So I think, and that's my second answer, what we have seen, comparing a large set of regions around the world, in Europe, etc., that regions that have those 10 elements properly functioning are much more likely to have high levels of entrepreneurship than regions that have none of these elements well functioning. And then in between, there are some configurations that help regions to get from one level to a higher level. But the ultimate logic we sort of uncovered and confirmed in our data analysis is that you would like to tackle the weakest link in order to have the overall ecosystem performing slightly better, which then leads to higher levels of productive entrepreneurship, and at the end of the day, also higher levels of welfare. And just as Victoria just said, you first need to have a good diagnosis of what are the weakest links. And of course, there are interventions around. So how can you improve talent, particular skills in your region, or how can you improve particular parts of the finance funnel in your region, or how can you improve the supply of intermediate services, for example, incubators, accelerators. There is particular knowledge about these particular interventions, but the effect of these interventions very much also depends on the overall state of the ecosystem where you are responsible for, so to say. So I think the good news is that we know that improving the weakest link is a good way forward. The bad news is that there's no sort of guaranteed silver bullet kind of intervention that we have solid academic proof that it works in many contexts.
Vicky, can I follow up with one just point? Yeah, thank you for that. And I think saying the weakest, like looking at the weakest link and trying to lift that up, I think that's a clear message that obviously, like you said, it's not a silver bullet, but from the research perspective, if you had to say, like, what is the message to policymakers, if they're, because that's what we're trying to do, right, is gather all the evidence and say, okay, if you're not a researcher, if you're trying to make real world decisions, what does it tell you? And so would it be accurate to say that that one of that there is not clear evidence on which types of interventions are the best, but there is clear evidence on the sort of pillars that have to be in place in an ecosystem, and by focusing on some of the weaker links, you can make an effect. I mean, that, you know, hopefully. Would that be sort
Yeah.
of an accurate statement for us to communicate?
Yeah, and I think the good news is that sort of developing entrepreneurial ecosystem development as a practice or a profession is one of the way forwards, which means that you don't have the ultimate high level knowledge on what would be good for this particular region or city, but you know that it is important to have this collective learning process to improve the ecosystem at large going is very important. And I think on the other hand, we're also still learning on how to do this and how to make this better. And I think also Andy is a good platform to inform each other, to learn from each other how this entrepreneurial ecosystem development function or profession should be further developed in order to be most effective.
Did you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so it is, yeah, there's no evidence around it, but I think what we're going to have to do is start experimenting with various ways of, you know, providing this entrepreneurial support. Again, it's very early days in terms of, you know, the knowledge base around the effectiveness of ecosystems, but again, doing and then learning from that, I think, is the only way we start to figure out if this is effective or not. And sharing knowledge around that is definitely a plus for us.
Well, great. I think we're right at time, which is perfect. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to send them to me and I can share them with our panelists and kind of get a follow-up. But I really appreciate both of your time and everyone who joined. If there's anything you want to plug, like any research or any upcoming events, please feel free to do that now. If not,
well, perhaps
okay.
if I'm allowed to do so. So the lack of evidence is not a reason to stop thinking, but especially to continue to experiment, as Ham said, and also learn from each other. So I would really like to have a call for action to join forces and to also organize platform events in which we can learn from each other and also to continuously monitor our own back gardens to learn from not only our back garden but also from others. So it's really I would appreciate if the participants also meet afterwards in other events, and we at Utrecht University are organizing events, for example a winter school for young early career researchers to get better about collecting knowledge data about this phenomenon. So that's one gesture from my side.
Of course, yes, much appreciated and agreed. Call to action is definitely important. Well, as far as Andy events go, this discussion is part of a series. So we have 2 more events this week. As you can see on my screen, what you need to know about talent management and what you need to know about job quality in SGBs. And then those are accompanied by reports, same as this one. I shared the link earlier, but you can find all of our new reports at andyglobal.org/Andy-research. And yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining, and thank you Eric and Ham for your insight. It was a great conversation. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Excellent.